Welcome back, everyone. And in this session, we're going to be hearing from Frank Furedi. His talk is called The Politicisation of Identity and the Crusade Against Moral Judgment. Frank Furedi is emeritus professor of sociology at the University of Kent, author of What's Happened to the University, and about 20 other books. So take it away, Frank.
Thank you. I'm going to stand up, and I've got an imaginary PowerPoint you can all sort of look at. And I've kind of changed my talk a little bit in light of what's been said, because I think it's quite important that we stay focused. And I like to begin my talk by beginning with what can be done, and then continue and justify it in terms of the way that I see the moral issues kind of kicking in. And I think when Nigel posed to us that we should think about what we can do, it's important to realize that what we can do is probably a little bit different, because we all have different skills and we all have different strengths and weaknesses. And I know what I'm pretty good at, and I know what I'm not that particularly good at. So I think that that's one way of going down the road. The one thing, as a caveat, I want to say is something that I worry about, some of the points that have been said, or implicitly, which is the use of power to solve our problem that was raised earlier on. And I'm all for organizing, and I'm doing whatever we can to make life hell for our opponents. You know, I'm not particularly a soft individual when it comes to that. But the one thing we need to be wary of is to lose the moral argument by behaving the way that our opponents do. I think that's really important. There's always a temptation to rise to the occasion and become caricatures of ourselves. And in particular, I'm very loath to do anything that gives the impression that our commitment to academic freedom is selective. That it's very, very good for us, but not for those guys. And therefore, I'm very loath for us to actually rely upon governments and official agencies to solve the problems that, whether we like it or not, we have to solve ourselves. The problem of the academy can only be resolved within the academy. It cannot be done by using forces outside. We can try to get whatever help we can, but at the end of the day, it's down to us. And it's very important to realize that, in a sense, you know, the one area where we're particularly weak at, where we can improve quite a bit, is in terms of getting our arguments right. I mean, I'm always surprised that friends of mine who are old-fashioned conservatives and others who are trying to kind of kick back never actually challenge the arguments that are dominant in the university, the dominant, their values. They sometimes call them moral values, but I don't think they're moral values. They're what the sociologist Jürgen Habermas once called administratively manufactured values. If you ever look at a mission statement of a university, you almost get the impression that they were all written by the same person, whether it's Oxford or the newest university in Northumbria. The mission statements all have the same kind of values, what they call core values. So what's the first core value? Diversity. Now, where I come from, diversity is a description of something. It means many. But why should, at what point in time did diversity turn into a philosophical value? Right? That's like saying that the sun coming up in the morning is a value, because that's just a fact of life, that there are many of us. And I think what we've done is we've kind of never challenged those values. I'll talk about this a little bit kind of later on. I think myself, I see myself in terms of my own career, three areas where I think it's important to fight back. The first one is that we have to realize that the cultural and the intellectual and moral resources supporting academic freedom are very weak. There's a lot of rhetorical commitment to academic freedom, but when push comes to shove, most people use the expression, I believe in academic freedom, but. Right? And the buts are really what's really quite important. And certainly it's been my experience in the academy, sort of where I've been writing about academic freedom since the middle 80s. And I remember I began writing about academic freedom a long time before the present wave of problems, and it was in relation to the imposition of all these quality assurance institutions. I don't know if you know what a learning outcome is. If you don't, you're okay. You don't have to know it. But it's when they told us that we need to have learning outcomes in our courses, when in fact the whole beauty of teaching in a university is that you don't know what the outcome is going to be. It's a voyage of discovery. So if you impose an outcome on it, then what you're doing is you're curbing my right to teach what in line with my own inclination to develop my kind of ideas. And there was all these things that came in. And I wrote a series of articles in the Times Higher about it. And a lot of my colleagues looked at me as if, on what planet does this guy live? Why is this an attack on academic freedom? And ever since that time, they've been saying this in relation to everything else. So one of the big problems that we have got to confront is very often they say, and this is particularly the case on the people that are attacking us, the expression they always use is, what's the fuss about? What's the big fuss? This is not, I don't see any real encroachment on your freedom. And of course, the more they repeat what's the fuss, the more what they're saying is they've acquiesced to it. They've internalized the logic of basically giving up on their freedom. And basically, at that point, their commitment becomes entirely rhetorical. So that's the first thing. I think we have to develop better arguments and be more robust in defending academic freedom, not allowing the rhetoric of acceptance to just simply lie in that kind of superficial way. The second problem, which hasn't been discussed, but I think it's the biggest problem in Britain, and it's now becoming a problem in Holland, even Italy, somebody mentioned. I've been to Italy recently. I've encountered it in a lot of other continental countries. It's a growing shift towards self-censorship. Where people simply, sort of look at their shoelaces when they see something uncomfortable, and they refuse to stand up and be counted. And I've got a lot of colleagues who are like that. I did an article a day after Brexit referendum in the Times Higher, where I talked about the fact that I came out and supported Brexit. I was probably the only sociology professor doing that. and I kind of explained why that was and how, how empowered a lot of people felt like that. And I also made the point that a lot of people I know in universities were too scared to admit that they voted for Brexit. They were actually just basically, that's not something you're going to raise. Next morning, I got about 75 emails from all kinds of academics, and they basically, the emails went like this. Frank, I love what you said in the Times Higher. I think it was really good that you came out and said all these things, but I couldn't possibly say it. Right? It's not something that I could possibly say. And the email I sent back basically said, look, you're not living in Stalinist Russia or in Nazi Germany, right? Things aren't as bad as all that. Isn't it better that you came out and explained your view and stood up and fought alongside a lot of other people? And I think that's a very important thing for us to do, is to get there's a lot of people around who know we're right, who intuitively understand that what we're doing makes a lot of sense, but at the moment, haven't got the moral fiber to be able to feel that they can stand up and be counted. And I think that layer of individuals on campuses is really, really very important. And finally, and for me most importantly, something I want to do much more before I drop dead, are young people. And I do mean young people. I've spent a lot of my time the last 2 or 3 years talking to 16 to 18-year-old kids, people doing A-levels or a year before they're doing A-levels. I've done that on the continent where I go into schools, and I talk about freedom. I talk about risk-taking. I talk about Aristotelian virtues. I talk about the kind of things that I think can turn young kids on, and where the idealism could be harnessed to something that is really constructive. And the reason why I do that is not because I love children. I haven't got any pedophile tendencies or anything of that sort. I think that the reason why I do that is because I think by the time the children or the young people get to universities, the game is lost. I genuinely believe that. I really think that in Britain, and to some extent the United States, Canada, Australia, the education system and the quality of parenting that we have, the way that parenting works, means that by relying on psychological validation rather than the socialization of young people into values, what we're doing is we're systematically disempowering them. It's almost as if we're unwittingly decided, how can we make children be as passive, be as much estranged from an aspiration for individual autonomy as possible. So I think that's really the most important thing for someone like myself to do, because I do think that if you can crack that problem with a significant layer of young people, then that could change the kind of cultural balance, the balance of forces on campuses. I think that one of the most interesting things about universities, about what's going on today in the 21st century, was written in the 1970s, 40 years ago, by a man called Alvin Goldner, a sociologist. And he was describing what the role of universities had become, how the universities had changed. And he actually approved it. Alvin Goldner loved what was going on in the universities, but his analysis is absolutely right. He basically made the point that the role of the universities, and he's talking about the United States mainly, the role of the universities has become, has changed to become an institution of socialization. Universities which were previously devoted to truth-seeking and to the academic and enterprise were increasingly in the business of socializing young people in a way that distanced young people both from their parents and their communities. And he goes into great length to explain what's really going on, because he makes the point that what we're doing in the universities, and he's using the word we, that's what we're doing in the universities, is distancing the young students, the undergraduates that come in here, from the traditions and from the legacy of the community into which they were born into. That our job is basically to get them to leave the bad old days behind, the bad old values behind, and instead to accept the arguments that we're talking about. And this is what he says. Is basically saying that parental authority in general and paternal authority in particular find it difficult to impose and reproduce its social values and political ideologies on their children. And he's basically saying that that's a really good thing. The fathers in particular are becoming irrelevant. The parents are not being very good at socializing young kids. Now it's over to us. And he says this, he says, the new structurally differentiated educational system is in an increasingly insulated form from the family system, is becoming an important source of values among students, which diverges them from their families. The socialization of the young by their families is now mediated by a semi-autonomous group of teachers. In other words, what he's really saying is that the hardcore socialization that occurs is no longer carried out by the parents, it's being mediated through the colleges. And at that point, the number of students in universities was not nearly as high as it is now. Now we're talking about 1 out of 2 in many, many societies. So it is playing a very, very important role. And it then goes on, as a result of this development, public educational systems become a major cosmopolitizing influence on its students, with a corresponding distancing from localistic interest and values. In other words, what the universities are doing is separating students from their localistic interest and values. And Goldner asserted that particularly parental authority, is increasingly vulnerable and is thus less able to insist that children respect societal or political authority outside the home. So that's the 1970s. And I think his sociological analysis of the way that the university system had worked, and in particular their role in the socialization process, has become, if anything, really much more important. Goldner also uses a concept that I always use, which is that one of the things that universities do is what he calls linguistic conversion. Linguistic conversion. So the way you convert young people to these new ideas is not by giving them an ideological book or not by giving them a text. You get them to use a different language. And as we know from Orwell, if you can get people to use a different vocabulary than the one that is organic to their basic kind of personality or where they were born, then you have a very kind of different way of being. And by linguistic conversion, what he's really getting at is getting them to adopt new words, new modes of expressing themselves. And that's what universities have done. I remember the very first time when a speech code came into my university. This was done in early 80s. And I was the only person that refused to accept it. And I made a fuss about it because I refused to accept the expression of being a chairperson. I mean, I know it sounds trivial and everything else. So I ended up basically deciding I couldn't call myself a chairman anymore without invoking the wrath of everybody. So on my door it said, Frank Furedi, Chair of Sociology. And because I'm not English originally, and my language at that point wasn't that brilliant, I didn't realize I was falsely pretending to be a professor, because that's what a chair of sociology really meant. But basically, everybody called me a chair, and that was a that was my little rebellion against the code. But the code was accepted without a murmur by everybody. Right? These are adult men and women, with PhDs, who just basically allow their whole languages to change. And of course, once their language begins to change, then so does those of the children. And if you look at the language that we have adopted, its most important characteristics, and this was going to be my original topic of my introduction, is it's morally neutral. It's self-consciously a morally neutral language. Almost every word in the PC vocabulary is opaque. Inappropriate. You behave inappropriately. Well, what does that mean, inappropriately? Why don't you just say that you're bad, or you misbehaved, or make some kind of a moral judgment in relation to that? Inappropriate is one of those meaningless terms that conveys nothing. But at the same time, we all know what is really being said there, which is you're out of order, that's wrong. Or if I say something that offends somebody, they will say, what Frank has just said is problematic. Right? It's a very interesting idea, problematic, What does that mean, problematic? Is it a problem? What kind of problem? Is it a good problem or a bad problem? Anything of that sort. What does that mean? It's a meaningless term. Or, as happened to me once, after which I learned how to deal with these things, I use a Platonic method in teaching. I ask a lot of questions, why, which is now called academic bullying. But at that point, one of the students said that I was making her feel uncomfortable. And my answer at that point was, would you like to sit on a different chair where you're more comfortable, right? Or because to me, uncomfortable basically means that somehow your clothes are too tight, the chair is too sticky or something. But they're using uncomfortable, as a kind of obvious way that this is something, that has got inherently negative kind of qualities. And I made a list of the words that are now used in universities, and every single one of them is opaque. Every single one of them refuses to go on record, because moral neutrality is really very important. So you might ask the question, why is moral neutrality really important? Why is it that you have what the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman called, I can never pronounce the word, the adiaphorization of life? And that adiaphorization basically means the institutionalization of moral indifference, that we're just indifferent to moral questions. Why is that? Why did they do it? So you kind of begin to investigate this, and you begin to realize that there is something within moral neutrality that does convey some very powerful moral messages. But it's a moral message that kind of addresses you and me in an entirely different light. So for example, if somebody were to ask me, what are really the most important values, not the core values that are our mission statements, but the really important moral values that the university has embraced, what would that be? What would be the key thing that universities live their lives by morally? Right? I think it's really summed up in an expression that many of you would have heard many, many times, and you get that in schools now because it begins in schools. Have you ever heard somebody say that there is no right or wrong answers? It's an interesting idea. I'm coming to universities, and there is no right or wrong answers. You could search for the truth all your life, but there is no right or wrong answers. And in fact, what that kind of statement implies and signifies and hints is that the real important moral value universities that has been sacralized to some extent is the value of non-judgmentalism. I mean, non-judgmentalism, where I come from, is a sin. There's nothing virtuous about not judging each other. As Hannah Arendt explained once, if we don't judge each other, we don't take each other seriously. Right? If we don't judge each other all the time, there is no public sphere, public space within which the debate occurs. Non-judgmentalism has become this unspoken value. And it gets to the point at which if you even begin to make there's even the slightest hint that you're judging something or somebody, you now call this an American expression I love, which is called judgy. Sort of that, being judgy, means you're a real moral outcast. You certainly don't go to Upper West Side dinner parties if you're a little bit judgy. So non-judgmentalism, I think, is really quite important, because the virtue of non-judgmentalism in the way that it works in universities is that it relieves people of the moral responsibility for their statements or for their actions. It leaves everything up in the air. That's really what's so important about it. And this is very, very interesting about how non-judgmentalism is now taught now in schools. I mean, children in schools learn to be non-judgmental at the age of 6. We're not here to judge. Instead of, cultivating the habit of intellectual curiosity, whereby judging is part and parcel of their exploration of the world. It's the way we prepare them for independence. The second core value in my book, not in the mission statement, is, have you ever heard of the virtue of openness? Now, I love openness. I think we all need to be open to new experience. It's part of what a liberal arts education is. But when openness becomes a dogma, and openness becomes a virtue in and of itself, then it becomes a call for conformism. Because basically, if you're meant to be open to everything, if openness has got this all-expensive, kind of aspect about it, totally, what you're really saying is that at the end of the day, we are so open that we can't really make any claims that this way of behaving is better than that way of behaving, that this culture is preferable to the other culture, that there's no way we can make any kind of judgments of value. And I think openness has become this kind of incitement that that kind of becomes increasingly sort of very, very powerful. And the third, in a sense, the third important value that, in a sense, works to demoralize the way that universities work is, of course, to get back to the old point, is that of diversity. Now, it's really worth pausing on the question of diversity, because the question that you got to ask is why is diversity so good? What's so good about diversity? And what's bad about it? Until very recently, I lived in a very small village in Kent called Neutrality. And some American Africanists came there. I used to be an Africanist in a different life, to visit me, to talk to me about some archival material. And they were white from California. And they arrived in Neutrality, in this little village in the middle of Kent. And the first thing they say, I feel a bit uncomfortable here. And the minute I heard uncomfortable, my radar went up. I said, well, why do you feel uncomfortable? Because this is one of the nicest places in the world. He says, it's not very diverse here, right? There aren't very many, there aren't many minorities here, right? So all I could say is that, when you go to a village in Botswana, as an Africanist, and you hang out there and all you see is black faces, do you say, I feel very uncomfortable here? There is no kind of diversity here. Is that what you're saying? And of course, what diversity has become is this signal that somehow diversity in of itself is a good thing. Now, you and I know that it's nice to have a mixture of things. You and I know that it's really okay when we live in a world where you hang out with different kinds of people, with different kinds of nationalities. But diversity is not necessarily a superior principle to homogeneity. Right? I mean, what's wrong with living in a homogeneous community? I mean, we all strive to know each other as much as possible. We all strive each other to kind of understand each other. Why counterpose one to the other? And I think what universities are doing in a sense of calling for diversity, and what's really important about that value, is it basically is used as a way of estranging ourselves from our own community. It's a way of making ourselves feel uncomfortable from where we've come from. And therefore, what we're seeing in the kind of moral values that are being peddled in universities is that their kind of key importance lies in detaching ourselves from our fundamental humanity, from where we are. It's about detaching ourselves ultimately from our families. Just to end, I always realized that even though I got very strong left-wing impulses, I was never like them totally. This already in the 1960s. Occurred when we were discussing it as student occupation or personal lives. And I happened to say, look, I got to leave the occupation because it's my mom's birthday, right? My mother's birthday. And they all looked at me as if I was some kind of pervert. You know, this guy is going off because it's his mom's birthday. And I said, yeah, my mom. Well, why is that important? Well, I love my mother, you know. And they couldn't understand how you could do what we were doing in the occupation and love your family. That kind of intimate ties of brothers and sisters and fathers and mothers and communities actually meant something very, very real. And at that point, I knew that I wasn't like them. I didn't know what I was, but I definitely knew that if we were creating a world where we become detached from our own past, from our own family, from our own foundational experience, then essentially we become abstract, dehumanized individuals, which is the problem that we're creating within the universities. And we have got to develop the intellectual capacity to challenge that. We've got to go on their terrain, on the terrain of values and morality, and demonstrate to us that it is us that have got moral authority. It is us that are arguing for a good life, and you are doing something that ultimately is decadent and destroys all of our civilizational achievements. Thank you.